Good morning and welcome to this conversation. I'm Alejandro. I'm a professor at Georgia Tech, and I'm here with Bart DeMonk and Warren Rojas, two industry experts, and today we're going to talk about last mile. So why don't you all quickly introduce yourselves?
Yeah, thanks, Alejandro. I'm Bart DeMonk. I've been in the industry over 30 years. I've been on the logistics and asset-based side, also on the shipper side with PepsiCo, and then also did research at the Gartner research firm.
Yeah, Alejandro, thanks for having me today. Like Bart, I've been in the transportation space 25 years, both on the operations side as well as technology.
Great. So maybe staying with you, Warren, why don't we start by defining what the last mile is?
Yeah, great question. And I think about when people invest in technology, so the role of technology for last mile, but it could be last, first, or middle, right? I think of three things. I think one of automating manual processes, right? That's really a key part of investing in technology. Two is process efficiency. So how can I do this faster and more reliable? And three is time and money, right? So is there a way that I can reduce the amount of time it takes and perhaps save a few dollars, right? So automation, process efficiency, and cost takeout. To me, that's the role that that technology plays in last mile. Mm-hmm. I think, the one thing is the different folks I talk to out in the industry, they define last mile differently. And I think by industry segment, it can vary. I'll just give you three quick examples, then maybe we'll get Bart's thoughts on it.
Sure.
First, let's just take a heavy equipment industrial manufacturer, right? For them, a last mile delivery can be using my private or dedicated fleet to go to a construction site, right? So it's a big piece of machinery, but really they're leveraging technology to, first of all, route that asset and get to that address, for the construction site. If we take another example, more quick serve restaurant, who hasn't ordered DoorDash, right? I do it all the time, right? But that's that's more of, whereas industrial manufacturing was more of a B2B, this is a B to consumer, right? So B2C. And again, two different use cases completely. And the third one I'll mention is, let's take, for instance, maybe I go to Best Buy and I buy a home theater. And I hire the Geek Squad to come install that for me, right? So that's a whole nother level of last mile where there's a white glove service associated. Not only do I have to deliver, schedule an appointment, bring the product, but also install it. And I got to make sure that the customer experience is off the charts, right? So definitely. Again, three completely different use cases. So I think it's important to define last mile to address two things. What business challenge am I trying to solve? And two, how do I address that?
Great. Bart, what are your thoughts? How do you
I fully agree, right? I always think of last mile, of that movement of the inventory to its place of the final consumption, which is different if it's a industrial product that's going into manufacturing versus something that's going to a consumer. I think what's also very important to understand is that last mile has changed, right? So on the consumer side, when we used to go buy things 40 years ago, we had to go to a store. Yep. Then 30 years ago, with the advent of companies like Amazon, we could have it shipped to us. But typically, that was a longer period, and you would get it through parcel. Now, there's so many different ways of doing last mile. It's created so much complexity. The other part is also that, it used to be only retailers that did last mile. But now, to be honest, every manufacturer, especially in consumer product goods, are also retailers. You can go to any website and order that product directly. So now all of a sudden, as a manufacturer, I got to figure out, how do I do this last mile part? And then thirdly, I would say what the expectations were from consumer around that B2C last mile. Now we're seeing the same happening on, as Warren said, on that B2B last mile, where things like transparency, visibility, better communication between the different parties and the carriers have become a lot more important.
Definitely. So if I were to try to give a stab at a unifying definition of what the last mile is, what I tried to do is I say it's whatever a company's internal supply chain is, whether the end is a consumer or another business or even a construction site that's also owned by the same company, the last mile is the last leg of transportation, the last time that a good or a piece of equipment or a component is going to be shipped by my supply chain and end in its end destination, whether that end destination is still something that I control or something that goes to a customer. This is how I tend to think of the last mile. Does that sound like
sounds great, Alejandro.
a unifying definition? Yeah. And so this is, as you all mentioned, the interesting thing about the last mile is how much it has evolved over the last few years, and especially an accelerated growth in the many varying ways in which the last mile is managed and what it can mean over the last, let's say, decade or couple of decades. So that leads to many different challenges that are perhaps, some of them are shared by the last mile with other parts of the supply chain, but some are unique to the last mile. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what those challenges are. Maybe this.
Yeah,
I'll
start. First. One of the biggest challenges, obviously, is the fact that we've kind of sped up that whole last mile, right? We've gone from, getting something in a week to 2-day delivery to next day delivery to now things that you get within an hour. So how do you deal with that? Not just from a transportation perspective, that's one part to figure out, but how do you do that from a point of inventory? So does that mean you have to have inventory pretty much everywhere at every node? That becomes very expensive. That's why we've seen U.S. business logistics costs increasing year over year, because a lot of that is attributed to the increase of inventory holding costs. And the other part is, how do you continuously also still kind of satisfy the customer expectation? Because it used to be, give me the product at the best price. Now it's the delivery experience has become such an important part. So if you talk to retailers, that net promoter score, that customer satisfaction score, a lot of it has to do with the transportation part. And I think Warren might be able to talk about this more, but it's technology that's driving it, from routing to visibility, et cetera.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at technology and you look at what I'll say TMS solutions, transportation management solutions, or dispatch type solutions, right? They were not meant to be standalone solutions, right? They absolutely require data from other systems, right? So what's the demand signal? Hey, there's an order. I need to ship something from A to B, right? So that could be an ERP system. That could be collaborating with some of your carrier partners. Again, we need visibility. So as my shipment is in transit, is it delayed? Is it being delivered on time, et cetera? So again, what's the business challenge I'm trying to solve? What's the outcome that I desire? And based on those 3 use cases, it could be different systems that you need, right? So let's take the quick serve restaurant one. Again, DoorDash leaves my sandwich at my door, and they take a photo of it and they upload it. So there's technology required to be able to take, which is graphically a big file, right? The photo, upload it, and have the history as part of that transaction, right? You take the example of the Geek Squad that comes and installs a home entertainment center at my house. You might actually need to settle up on the invoice and the bill at that point with a credit card, right? So that's a different set of technology. So again, what business challenge am I looking to solve? What's the outcome that I want? And the technology needs to address it, soup to nuts. Make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So I see, I guess, in terms of challenges for the last mile, and specifically focusing on those that are unique to the last mile, there's a bunch of different things that we've talked about, and let me just highlight a few of these, and maybe you all can chip in on if you want to go in more detail on any of them. In the work that I've done on last mile logistics, the unifying theme, or one of the unifying themes to me, seems to be a higher degree of what we call dynamism compared to other parts of the supply chain. And what I mean by this is, if you compare the last mile to what's happening in middle mile or something like that, you tend to have processes happening simultaneously a lot more, and you tend to have to make decisions and maybe dispatch a route, right? Start your day when you still don't know what things are going to look like at the end of the day. And this drives a lot of other things, like we were saying, the cost challenges, the fact that the costs in the last mile are so much higher. I have to position my inventory. I have to maybe execute routes that are much less efficient, things like this. The service expectations that the customer has, the fact that we're now getting at the point where, 30 years ago, maybe I could get a pizza in 30 minutes, but now I can get like a battery. I can get all these crazy things, right? Not to mention something like expectations for, the customer might want me to do that, but might want me to do it in the most sustainable way possible. So there's all these different concerns that make the last mile unique. So maybe let's just see, any of those sound like things that you want to chime in on?
Yeah, I think the dynamism, it's also the complexity of the different ways that we're fulfilling the product. And I think even if you look at it kind of further upstream on planning side, right? We have a pretty good idea in supply chains what customer want to buy and when they're going to buy it. We don't always know how they want it fulfilled. Do you want to send it to our house? Do you want to pick it up at the store? And then not even talking about returns, because that could be different. I can get it at my house, but I bring it back to the store or to a locker. So dealing with all of that means that, yes, you have to work and optimize that in real time, but you also have to integrate that, as you said, with the warehouse for the picking, but also with the planning. Because in certain products, maybe apparel, it could be a signal that's coming from social media where all of a sudden there's a rage about a product and everyone wants that product. So how do you get that product there and in the hands of the consumer? Because we are about instant gratification. And that's not good for supply chain. So
we want it now. Yeah.
It certainly presents its challenges. And I'll say this, I mean, no longer do we have the days of, hey, I have 100 orders, let me run it through a batch optimization process and figure out the best way to ship it at the least cost while still maintaining the service level, right? I think now we're not only optimizing the planning, but we're optimizing the execution. So while in transit, maybe I have 12 stops on a truck, all of a sudden stop 2, there's a demonstration of some sort or a protest, and I can't even deliver those goods. Right then and there, dynamically, the system needs to tell me, how can I still complete all 12 stops today? What's the next logical one to go to, right? So again, it's not just optimizing the planning, it's optimizing the execution of these deliveries, and they certainly do present some challenges, right?
Yeah, or even something like adding new stops to a route when it already started. Maybe I've even went ahead and pre-positioned some of the most used inventory on the truck, right? And I'm making an additional stop that I didn't know for sure I was going to make, but I had a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll add a couple things there. I think as we look to the future, I think people are going to expect the technology to tell them, I know the traffic patterns in this area, in this city, in this urban area, right? Tell me when would be the best time to deliver these goods and on what days, right? I know a lot of retailers have schedules to store deliveries, but I think they're going to look for the technology to consider weather patterns, traffic congestion, and use that as part of the solve.
Absolutely.
Again, depending on the use case.
I'm definitely seeing that in on the research side as well. One thing that your comments make me think of also is something that is also unique to the last mile in many cases is congestion. You know, this is an extreme case of this would be a blockage that I can't access a delivery stop. But more generally, just the fact that a lot of these operations, a lot of these deliveries happen in urban areas, they're in congested areas, and I have to deal with things that are pretty unique and very different from what I would deal with in a port or in an open highway.
Yeah, I think we're right here at Georgia Tech, right? Very congested, a lot of people walking around. So actually, when I came this morning, I passed one of those delivery robots, right? That just autonomously goes on the sidewalk, delivers probably snacks and drinks, things like that, right. maybe even books. So we're going to see that more in heavily congested areas. But the thing is, that's just one other method of going to the customer. And what we're seeing as well with last mile is where companies before maybe had one way to go to that customer, maybe just private fleet or using the big parcel carriers, UPS, FedEx. Now there's so many different ways, whether it's on demand, it's hybrid, they're using more and more carriers. How do you deal with all that complexity? How do you deal with that multitude of variations? Without technology, it's very hard. 30 years ago, you were able to do that manually, maybe in a spreadsheet. That's how I started. When I was in the industry, people were doing things manually or figuring it out in a spreadsheet. We don't have the time, and we have so many more scenarios that we really need the technology to help us with that.
You know, we talk about supply chain and disruption, really, at the macro level. That's things like COVID or a port shutdown, right, or geopolitical situations, right? I think there's also micro kind of disruptions, right? So I changed my mind. I don't want that order. And what about the return? I think that needs to be considered in technology. And I think with the kind of agentic AI kind of initiative that's coming around, I think technology, because it learns from the data that it has, and it can then start to make recommendations on how I still, even though I have a micro disruption, I still might be able to make that order. And you know, again, I'll use the DoorDash example. Now they have, do you want a second stop? You're ordering a sandwich. Hey, do you need a soda from a local, your favorite shop, right? So I think starting to combine those two, and I think people will look for technology to make recommendations on, hey, opportunistic, there's an Uber driver at this location, and maybe I use a combination of my private or dedicated fleet and Uber to deliver my goods, right? So again, the mix of just the different ways of delivering goods to the final destination, I think is going to be a big thing in the future.
Yeah, and the thing, Alejandro, is also that, as we know, a lot of those deliveries are free, right? When you order online, you get free delivery. That's a huge cost for organizations. So they continuously have to look, as these transportation costs are going up, to optimize their supply chains better to get that cost lower. Because if they don't control that, and now their cost of delivery is going up from 15% to 30% just for the transportation part, now they're working with a negative margin. So how do you figure that out while still serving the customer in the way they want to be served?
Yeah, on that topic, I wonder if you all think, what you all think about the fact that it seems like we, as consumers, we were perhaps conditioned to expect free delivery from the early days of the internet, when a lot of companies were introducing these services. And we have now, we are essentially stuck in there. No company can really move out of that space because of the competition, right? So what do you all think the impacts of that have been on how these things operate?
Yeah, I will say I've been an Amazon customer since 1996.
Yeah, exactly.
And my expectation was never to get free delivery. That never came up. So they've kind of created
That's what I'm
that
saying,
for
exactly.
differentiation. And now we're all used to it. We don't want to revert. And if you actually see the surveys, like people will say, we will not buy at your side because at the end of it, when we go through the cart, you charge us a delivery fee. So they'll exit the cart. But what you can do is create more transparency around the delivery. Like, do you really need that today or tomorrow? Mm-hmm. And there's companies already years ago that said, hey, if you choose instead of 2-day delivery, 5-day delivery, we might plant a tree for you, or we give you a discount or something like that. And that has impact, especially with younger generations who are more environmentally minded, because a lot of consumers think about the environment in terms of, we want our products to be environmentally friendly. Packaging needs to be environmentally friendly. Mm-hmm. Now more and more, they're also looking at transportation from that perspective. But again, we need technology so we can create transparency. So if I say, I want it today, what is the impact on the environment versus if I do 5-day? And if I can see that, that might want to motivate me to say, you know what, that shirt, I'm not going to use it for another month. So I'll just get 5-day delivery.
Right.
Yeah, I'll say it brings me back to my days in retail. Early in my career, when I ran a transportation group at a retailer, and I would talk to the merchants, and I'd say, hey, can you get a price delivered to our facility, or a price where we'll pick it up at the vendor's facility? And they say, oh no, they don't charge me for freight. Mm-hmm. Well, nothing is free. So they were just weaving it into the price of the good, right? So I think, nothing is free. There's always a logistics cost, right? Yep. There's no free lunch. So I think, to Bart's point, the more we're educated around that, maybe we don't need it that same day, or maybe 2-day delivery, but give optionality and let the consumer choose. Here's 5 options. You choose. Yep. What is the priority, and how quickly do you need it? I think the second thing is the trade-off between same day or next day and the forward inventory positioning that you have to do in order to meet those service levels. What are my inventory carrying costs now, right? It's costing me a fortune to hold that much merchandise that close to my end consumer, right? So that's the big trade-off. And I think, depending on the industry, again, maybe some more luxury goods, they don't care. It's all about the customer experience. It's all about service. Other industries who are more profit and margin oriented, they might say it's costing me too much. So I think, to Bart's point, that's going to play itself out over the next several years.
Yeah, I'm reminded a little bit of a similar thing that happened in the news industry, which is with a lot of newspapers originally offered their online versions for free and then realized this was a huge mistake, and it took a long time for them to claw back to a paywall kind of a structure. But I'm actually struck also by Bart's comment, because I think there's some transparency in one sense, but in another sense, the issue is that you have to, if you are providing the last mile service, you have to bake that cost in somewhere, right? So I'm thinking of the fact that Amazon will charge you this membership fee, right? Or maybe what you're doing is you're charging a higher price, you're just baking it into the price of the goods so that the customer never sees it as a separate price. So no, in other words, like Warren is saying, there's no free lunch, right?
Yeah, you're correct, right? And it's also the responsibility of the supply chains to continuously evolve. And we've seen that over the last decade. Large grocery stores that said, instead of sending products from the DC to the customer, why don't we use all of our stores that are brick and mortar as an inventory location? Mm-hmm. And now, instead of having an average of move of 1,200 miles, we can reduce that to less than 300 miles and reduce cost and serve the customer faster. We've seen pet stores who during COVID said, instead of me shipping it to your house, if you come and pick it up at the store, I'm going to give you a $10 coupon. Mm-hmm. And guess what? Everyone that has a dog, when you go to the store, you probably pick up those extra little toys or cookies for your dogs. And actually, the additional revenue they generated more than offset that $10 coupon. So it's really around thinking out of the box of how can I make this more efficient? And that's really more across. It's looking not just at the transportation part, that's also looking at inventory. Mm-hmm. That's looking at planning. So I think going forward, companies need to look at this a lot more holistically.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that it also leads into a discussion of fulfillment strategies, which is a conversation we're going to have at a later time. So we've talked a bunch about these different challenges that you face in the last mile space. So what are some of the solutions? What are some of the new ideas that you all are seeing out there to solve these challenges?
Yeah, there's actually a lot out there, right? A lot of different methods of going to the customer. But I'd say that the biggest part that I've seen an evolution of is, and we'll talk about that more as well, but companies looking at it more holistically instead of like that multi-channel to omni-channel. I know we'll talk about more at a different time. But it's really, from a technology perspective, being able to bring all of that volume together, having a lot more intelligence behind it, mm-hmm. and then optimizing that. Not just optimizing it from my perspective as the shipper shipping it, but also saying, how do I at the same time serve my customer better? Again, going back to the retailer, I get a bigger customer satisfaction score. Immediately that correlates to additional revenue and additional profitability. And if you don't do that, then your costs are going to go up, but also your revenue is going to go down, right? So that's where we also, unfortunately, have seen large retailers going out of business, right? Because either they didn't have the right strategy, or maybe their focus was still too much on stores, which are pretty expensive footprints. So I think there's a continuous kind of relook. And I think nowadays, where a lot of companies have access, even within their TMS, to modeling capabilities, is instead of just trying it out, just model it. Run those different scenarios, understand the difference between how you're using different methods, like I mentioned, multiple different carriers or private fleets or on demand. Look at capacity, look at the use of that capacity, look at the quality of the service and the cost, and then make the right decision and look at how does that also impact the customer. So I think a lot of companies are very focused on that. And then the other part is as we're going into peak period, it used to be companies started preparing maybe a few months before that. Now they're starting like right after the previous peak period. January, they're already planning for the next period. And they're using more and more technology to model that, to look at things, and to be better prepared. And I think that's the true definition of being agile, is basically look at your options, and then when something hits, you can very quickly react to it because you've already modeled it.
Okay.
I'll just add, I like to watch movies. I still remember the movie Minority Report, right, where I think the scene was Tom Cruise walking through the mall and said, "Mr. So-and-so, you like these types of shoes?" So I think because of the data that we're collecting, and guess what? People are very willing to put their data out there these days,
no kidding. Yeah.
Especially the younger generation, right? So it's going to be more, hey, I'm going to anticipate you ordering a sandwich. I'm going to say, hey, I'm about to deliver a sandwich. Would you like one, right? So I think these prescriptive and really direct email or whatever it is, like they're going to come and say, I think you're going to order this anyway. Would you like one? Right. So I think that's where it's headed with all that data. That's
absolutely. The data. I think one of the things that on the research side I've seen is you absolutely have to use data. You have to be. What I would say is you cannot be myopic. The decisions you make when you're, whatever the last mile, the structure of your last mile is, the decisions you make have to anticipate not just your immediate costs, but the impact that has downstream. And if you can even be, so sometimes we say anticipatory or something like this, right? Like if we can even say even further, right? Like say, well, we think that this customer is going to like these kinds of options, so that's what we're going to offer to them. Absolutely. So what about, Another issue here which relates to congestion and some of the other topics we've touched on is density. So there are a variety of different methodologies that are emerging to improve route density, to make routes more efficient. For example, locker delivery is one thing we haven't talked about too much yet, but what do you all think about that?
Yeah, it's different, right? Like I live in Texas, so we got a lot of space. So it's a little bit different than if you, for example, live in New York City. We see even large geographic differences, right? Lockers, for example, are very much used in Europe. Why? Because here, like in Texas at least, when you're not home, they just leave the box in front of your house. Yes. But if you have small homes or you're right on the street or you're in apartments, they're not going to leave the box. But they can leave it maybe if you're using a bus stop or you're leaving or you're taking the train to work every day. There's lockers there, and you just pick it up on your way to work. I've even seen retail stores there where you go shopping, but you don't have to carry it back all the way back, maybe a mile away from where you parked the car. You just leave it there, and then they ship it to your house. So it's quite different in the region where you are, and a lot of companies, again, have tried those different things of what is working. So it's both efficiency of the assets you have on the road, so the drivers in where they can create good routes to have them do as many stops as they can. Where they don't do that, maybe you'll outsource that to an on-demand driver if it's something that's out of route. And where maybe you have big concentrations of people going to stores, you say, hey, we'll have a locker at the Kohl's or even at the UPS, they'll have lockers, and you drop it off, right? You incentivize people to say, hey, if you just want to drop it off anywhere like a return, it's going to cost you. But if you drop it off at exactly that location, it's free of charge. So there's a lot of different ways of dealing with that. But yeah, congestion is something that for companies, especially that are global and that are more regional, is a big, big factor because they have to look at all those scenarios, not the easy ones.
Yep.
Well, I think the locker thing is more on the return side, right? And I don't know if in my house, 8 out of 10 packages get returned.
Okay.
My wife likes to order a lot, but then she also likes to send. So I think the cost and putting it back into that network to either get back to the original manufacturer or vendor is a lot, right? So to Bart's point, send it to a locker and then you can make a decision. Is it a defective product or did they just not like the color? And could we take that same package and service another customer order instead of sending it all the way back to the original manufacturer or vendor, right? So I think the returns and the consolidation of the nodes within the supply chain, that's where, again, it's going to be an evolution here.
Yeah, the first mile of return logistics,
right,
which is the last mile of regular logistics, to me, my impression is it's way less studied and way less optimized than the regular last mile, and there's lots of opportunities there for improvement.
Why do you think Amazon says just keep it?
Yeah,
don't even return it.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
because it costs them too much to return.
They don't know what to do it. So either they say don't send it back to us, or even if you send it back, a lot of that ends up in landfills. Yeah. So we have to be a lot more conscientious about what we order. But I would say on the outbound side, there are scenarios like in the services industry where maybe I'm a plumber or an electrician. I need something for the next day. Well, that supply chain works at night. They'll bring it to a central node, and then on the way the next day to your job site, you can pick up that particular replacement product. So it can go both ways, right? It's
Definitely.
What makes sense. And again, it's all about setting expectations. We're all expecting everything to be delivered to us. There used to be a time not that long ago when we wanted to buy something, we would have to go to the store.
Yeah.
So we are programmed, and I think there are ways to kind of deprogram ourselves and to say, you know what, if we get the right incentive, we can still do things that are maybe better for the supply chain. and better for those shippers, but they have to figure out the right method of doing that.
Yeah. So maybe one last topic of conversation as we wrap this up. One thing we haven't talked about too much is the workforce side. So we've talked about the customer, we've talked about the system, but on the workforce side, I'm thinking specifically of the fact that there's all these gig options now. So in many, many last mile situations, I no longer have to plan for the absolute peak. I can plan for a more base case, and then I can use some kind of a gig option as my surge, as my capacity surge. What are the challenges or the opportunities you all see there?
Yeah, like you said, right? It's for surge or even for out of route type of deliveries where you can do that. It's a great way to kind of add on to your capacity, because we know that there's a lot of carriers, even fleets, that are kind of capacity constraints, right? The traditional method of drivers is not always as attractive. But if you have on demand where people can decide what hours to work, they make it easy. They might have a day job, and in the evening, they either drive people or they drive goods, or even both, right? They drop someone off, pick up a product, pick up maybe even someone's pet. So to combine that, and again, I think it's the technology that brings all that together, because you don't have to go look for work. It sits right there on your phone. So I think the ability to have that technology, to have it in people's hands, is creating a lot more capabilities and a lot more, I would say, capacity in the market that gives flexibility in options and sometimes lower cost options to those shippers.
I agree with all that. I think people will rely on agentic AI to make those recommendations and have opportunistic, hey, there's a driver available, why not let them carry it? I think what people need to be careful of is protecting their brand, right?
I was going to say, what are the risks?
What are the risks associated? I think whether you're handling that internally with your own employees or your own fleet versus a third party, and again, I think there has to be a rigorous process to educate and train those, especially take that Geek Squad example, right?
Yeah, you're not going to do white glove.
Right, you're not going to do white glove with a third party. So I think in some industries, in some use cases, it will apply. In others, especially for brand protection, it may not apply.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to get the jewelry delivered, no. Right? Your wife's $10,000 engagement ring,
right? Or the heavy construction
like
equipment. Yes, yeah. Neither one of those.
I think one challenge though is on the other side, right? For this last mile to fulfillment is the warehouse, and the warehouse. That's where we've seen a lot more challenges on warehouse labor, availability of warehouse labor, and so that's where we've seen people obviously go a lot to automation and robots to replace not people, but replace or fill in the gap that we have where we have the shortage of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so thanks very much for this conversation. I look forward to speaking with you all again.
All right.
Thanks, Alejandro.
Thank you. Yep.